Okay, 2 episodes down, we've thought about the background of the philosophical scientific problems of testing evolutionary hypotheses. We've thought about the difficulties of honing in and the complexities of honing in on what we should be trying to explain if we're looking at trying to explain disorder. Now we get into the fun bit of actually working out what evolutionary explanation fits the best. This could apply across evolutionary psychology as well as in evolutionary psychiatry. It's where you start hopefully reaching answers, deciding between hypotheses, making true progress.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry Podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more.
Okay, so those are the steps that are absolutely necessary for evolutionary medicine and evolutionary psychiatry, describing, categorizing, and integrating. And we've honed in on the thing that we want to try and explain with an evolutionary explanation. So then we come into the second kind of major stage, which is broken up into two stages of the DCIDE framework, which is depiction and evaluation. Depiction is actually comparatively simple and not that novel. It's basically saying, hey, we've got this thing that we need to explain, the autism spectrum. And give me your best story, basically. What is the possible explanation for why these traits persist? One thing that is important is that what we're looking for here is an explanation of why the trait persists down the generations, why it's been reproductively successful and has these characteristics. So theoretically here, you could bring in any kind of explanation from any paradigm that you want. So say that you are a person who really believes that Toxoplasmodia gondii, is it? Toxoplasma. The virus which cats give you, was in cat urine or whatever it is, and say you think that actually autism is caused by toxoplasma, you should be trying to explain why this kind of heritable trait persists down the generations and is reproductively successful. That's the main aim of any depiction, and it could be so if you come from like a simple disease model. And you could just say it's consistent infections, basically. Every new generation is just getting infected. The heritable component is just like your inherited susceptibility to this particular type of infection. That's what explains the trait. And you can provide that as a depiction, and eventually we will compete that depiction with any other depiction. When you're providing your hypothesis, the evidence that you should really concentrate on is of the thing that, so from an evolutionary perspective, it would be of the function kind of functioning. If what you're trying to do is explain why wings exist or eyes exist, or autism exists, what you should be doing as an evolutionary theorist is saying, okay, here's this thing that we know we need to explain. Here's my hypothesis, and I think that eyes are for seeing, and here's all the reasons why. And basically give direct evidence of why eyes seeing is good for reproductive success, or wings flying, or autisming. So, whatever you think autism, or depression or anxiety, or whatever your hypothesis is, this is the stage where you put it forward. The thing to concentrate on is, this direct evidence of function. Or if you're trying to provide a disease explanation, you should be providing direct evidence of the disease kind of constantly getting into the next generation. Whatever is explaining the reproductive success of the trait, basically, the reason that it's being passed on down the generations. Okay, that's it, basically. That's it. Just provide your hypothesis, and we will then end up comparing them for their sufficiency. The the case of autism, there are 3 major hypotheses that I look at in the DECIDE framework paper, which are the leading hypotheses, but I mean, those aren't the only hypotheses. There are other autism hypotheses, like there's one called the solitary forager hypothesis, which says that autistics would go out and hunt alone, basically, and then would succeed because they're hunting alone rather than as a group. That's okay, fine. That's a hypothesis. You can compare it with everyone else's. If you wanted to, you could depict it, and we would evaluate it and see how they all stack up, basically. In the paper, I don't go into that. I look at 3 main hypotheses, one by Simon Baron-Cohen, one by Bernie Crespi, and one by Marco Del Giudice. The basic differences and similarities between them are they all look at autistic strengths in some way. So for decades, in fact, even really since the dawn of the autism diagnosis, it's been noticed that autistic people have these sorts of interesting strengths in perceptual intelligence or like memory, certain types of like cognitive experiments where they have to perform rationally. There's all sorts of cognitive tests which you can give to autistic people and to show that they are somehow superior to neurotypicals in some way. Similarly, I mean, so each of the authors that I look at, Crespi, Baron-Cohen, and Del Giudice, have like slightly different takes on what these strengths are, or they look at slightly different elements. Del Giudice in particular looks at differences in relationship style. So he proposes that autism is to some extent about like a high investment parenting strategy. So being more autistic means that you really care more about like particular children and particular relationships, and you invest strongly in those rather than being neurotypical where you might care less but then have more children elsewhere. So that's like one nuance to his theory. Simon Baron-Cohen looks at the differences in technical ability in particular, and also the fact that relatives of autistic individuals are often more to be engineers or scientists, work in maths. He talks about this as a systemizing kind of cognitive phenotype. So basically systemizing is your ability or your tendency to be drawn to kind of physical systems rather than the human world. And Bernie Crespi similarly looks at sort of the same strengths around intelligence, maybe concentrates a little bit more on these like very specific perceptual abilities and differences between autistics and non-autistics. So they all kind of lay out these various areas of strength and say, this somehow is the explanation. Like the reason that autism persists some generations is because of these traits. There are slight differences in the model that they use, though, of the evolutionary persistence. So Simon Baron-Cohen and Marco Del Giudice both kind of say that there's essentially like specializing, that people have strengths and weaknesses, and through that, they would fit into a particular type of social niche. So the idea is that it's actually kind of good to be somewhere on the spectrum to a certain extent, and you end up like no one can do everything. Every cognitive type has trade-offs. The people who are autistic are manifesting this sort of slightly worse socializing, but slightly better in other sort of object-oriented kind of intelligence ways. Both of them kind of say that, and that they fill a bit of a niche in society. Marco Del Giudice also says that there's a niche for being a slow parent who invests a lot in kids rather than being a sort of more wayward, fast kind of mate-switching parent. Okay, Bernie Crespi's model is slightly different, and I mean, I should couch this in saying that in the paper, I characterize it as a sort of byproduct model, but he's written a few papers saying different things about autism at different times, and he's since told me that he doesn't exactly think of it as a byproduct model. I'm still trying to work out exactly what his model of the reproductive success of autism itself is. The main point for the paper is that there's these 2 quite distinct types of hypothesis. One is that, and this could apply across all evolutionary explanations, basically. You can either claim that the disorder itself or something like on these traits is adaptive, is like fitness enhancing, has benefits to that person. Or you can claim that those traits are a byproduct of benefits elsewhere for other individuals or kind of within the same person, but like not exactly those traits. So there is a nuance here, which is really important to pick apart because they have very different predictions for who is sort of benefiting. And then it's a different kind of evolutionary model. They aren't entirely in contrast. So basically Bernard Crespi's article, 2016 article, is called Autism as a Disorder of High Intelligence. Talks a lot about how human intelligence has evolved and basically says that autism is a sort of, arises when there is over-exaggerated perceptual intelligence, as he calls it, but low like social verbal intelligence. So it's sort of an imbalanced set of intelligences. But he doesn't seem to be saying that being on the autism spectrum is kind of good, or that like there are strengths and weaknesses which balance out, or that there's a niche for autistics. It's more the thing that was good was general intelligence being selected for everyone. It's good for everyone to be intelligent. As a sort of byproduct of that, you occasionally have autism, which is kind of costly to those individuals, but is justified. So these are quite distinct hypotheses. One is like, okay, it's sort of bad, but it's good in the population. The other is it's actually good for those individuals. Okay, and maybe that's not Bernie's exact idea, but that is definitely, those are the two kind of main evolutionary hypotheses you might make to this integrated spectrum. Then, okay, we take these hypotheses, and as I say, anyone else can provide their hypothesis here. They should give the direct evidence. Then we get to evaluating these hypotheses. This is where, the DSI framework does actually add something to what we already have. So the state of the art at the moment is basically, someone will publish a paper, Bernie will publish a paper, Marco Del Giudice will publish a paper. They'll take a load of evidence around autism, they'll look at the strengths, and they'll sort of, not quite in a reverse engineering way exactly, but they'll just sort of point to these strengths, talk about evolution of intelligence, and then kind of come out and say, we think this is why. But the problem is that these accounts have been criticized basically for just so storytelling. So who is deciding what evidence you can put in that paper? At the end of the day, it's just, 8,000 words where you can kind of run free. You can look at all of the strengths of autism, or if you're not an evolutionary theorist and you're a clinical psychologist, for instance, you can write a hypothesis about all of and look at all the evidence of the weaknesses of autism, and you can really concentrate on some facts more than others. So for instance, Simon Baron-Cohen in one of his earlier papers calling the autism the extreme male brain hypothesis of autism, basically said, well, the key fact to think about is like, look how male this is, look how masculine, like how much more common this is in males, how it's an exaggeration of male thinking. This is maybe the core thing we need to explain. And basically everyone has had carte blanche to pick whatever specific piece of evidence they want and create a story around it. There's no real push to incorporate anyone else's evidence. And I think basically the field could go on for 1,000 years. I mean, it's already gone for 100 years with this sort of being the main format of evolutionary storytelling. And the problem here is that you can engage in cherry picking. You can pick evidence that fits your hypothesis, but purposefully ignore or just accidentally ignore evidence that doesn't fit your hypothesis. This is a problem without any kind of structure or system here. We are doomed to endless hypothesizing, basically. One person can throw out their hypothesis, another person can do theirs, and it's like, well, how do you pick? Especially because you can't ever go back in time and actually test any of them, right? So that's what the final stage of evaluation is for. And it picks up on some of the kind of insights from earlier in the framework, but also adds some new ones. So there are a couple of things you have to do at first. Evaluation really has 3 stages, but the DCIDE acronym was too good to dissolve into some sort of, DCIDER or something. What it would have been. Anyway, the point is, evaluation Okay, there are a couple of initial stages which are more standard scientific practice. Like, at first, you just have to check that the evidence is replicable. If you're citing stuff about autistic strengths, is that real? Is it good science? Is it based on sound theory? So it's possible that whoever's put in their hypothesis at the depiction stage could basically be basing it on very, very weak evidence, in which case we should just exclude it. So if you think about the earlier example of the evolutionary psychologists of the dual mating strategy hypothesis, really, we should have really tested that female ovulatory windows do align with differences in attractiveness or desire to have sex with different people. If that evidence had replicated, or if we'd been careful and realized that we should really check that evidence does replicate, then we would have realized okay, you should actually exclude that hypothesis at this stage. You don't need to really think about it if it's just not good science. Then you can think about compatibility. So if of the hypotheses that have just come in, and that are trying to explain the same thing, maybe it's possible that they are citing evidence which is kind of undermining of each other. So in the case of autism, this doesn't really happen because Baron-Cohen, Crespi, and Del Giudice all kind of cite basically the same areas of strengths. And they all are, sort of in alignment. However, it's possible that, for instance, if the solitary forager hypothesis was in there, you might find that there's evidence that autistics are just not good at hunting, basically. And it's possible that someone will pick up that evidence and say, well, this is contradictory to your hypothesis. So it's then possible to exclude at an earlier stage if someone is carrying on evidence which is falsifying another hypothesis. Okay, this is sort of basic sciences stuff. This isn't too complicated. People are already doing this. It's not too novel anyway. One thing to note about the three autism hypotheses is that Baron-Cohen and Del Giudice are very similar in their evolutionary model. They're both kind of saying the autistic people fit into this special niche. Crespi is quite different. The main difference between Baron-Cohen and Del Giudice is that Del Giudice thinks that the autism is a lot of it is about this parenting strategy, this different strategy to romantic relationships. Now, he based this on a study of, I think, 199 students, where he found the autistic traits associated with, basically a classroom, associated with slightly different strategies to dating. However, this evidence is really messy, and if you look elsewhere in the autism literature, you'll find that it's not obvious that autistics have this slow, caring relationship strategy. The point is that this part of the hypothesis is kind of weak, and okay, maybe I've talked to Marco about this, and he's sympathetic that the evidence isn't great, but he thinks that there could be something there, and I agree, but I think we do need more evidence to check that. And the thing to do right now, also for the purposes of simplifying the paper, is to basically say that Baron-Cohen and Del Giudice both kind of align and essentially proposing the same thing, which is that autism evolved to fit into this systemizing, tool-making, memory-having, obsessiveness kind of niche. And that's the reason why the autism spectrum exists. Crespi is really pushing something quite different. Maybe he's not exactly pushing that, but for the purposes of this, you can also compare that to the byproduct model, which is that autism is a sort of accidental byproduct of general intelligence in the species. Okay, so to simplify, two hypotheses. One is that intelligence for everyone is good. It comes with a cost of autism occasionally. The other is being on the spectrum somewhere is kind of good. There's strengths and weaknesses, and you can fit into a niche in society by having these traits. quite distinct hypotheses, different predictions about the fitness of different people, basically. Okay, so how do we decide between them? Decide, get it? Okay, so so evaluation, after checking that the evidence is good and the theory is sound and that no one is undermining each other with evidence that they're already citing, we can start looking at what I call the circumstantial evidence, and which is stuff that I've actually already been talking about, so it'll be quite familiar. Once again, we can look to visibility variables. So yeah, just to like recap on like how a lot of this previous work has been done, it's just kind of picking up random experiments and saying like, oh, but there's this strength here, and then, but oh, there's this weakness here. What do you do? And like, which experiments do you run to really test which is the correct strength to look at or the correct weakness to look at? This is basically like a really hard problem. But there are these standardized areas of evidence which should exist for every single trait, which you can just look at and which are very nicely, easily, objectively observable. Okay, and hopefully at least they're more easily objectively observable than many things that you can look for with these psychological traits, which is, what age does it arise at? How long does it last for? All the stuff that I've been talking about, the prevalence, right? It's going to be quite hard to agree on which cognitive test we should give to test the exact strength and whatever. But what we should be able to agree on is these facts about prevalence and age of onset and duration and sex differences and environmental effects. Yeah, this at least is like the most basic objective observable evidence. And thank you, Lord, again, there are, in the same way that the basic principle of increasing visibility to selection is the way to find the trait which is most likely to be adaptive. If you want to pick out the thing that you need to explain, you need to think about what's most visible. When you're really comparing hypotheses, when you're evaluating them, you can go further than that and say, not only should the trait be more visible, but its specific visibility should relate to the explanation. So it's not just that when we're looking for the thing that could be adaptive, we need to look across a wider range of the population and for the earlier trait. Actually, the very specific facts about what age that trait existed at and how many people it is in and how long it lasts for, these are very specific facts which should relate to the explanation. Every explanation out there, whether it's about toxoplasma or byproducts or social niches, should be able to explain all these facts about the thing. So yeah, do they, basically? And so in this final stage, you go through and you look at these 5 areas of evidence again, and you ask, well, is this what the hypothesis predicts? Does this really nicely fit in with the social niche hypothesis or the byproduct hypothesis or the toxoplasma hypothesis? Is this what we predict? Is the duration what we predict? Is the age of onset what we predict from these hypotheses? And yeah, again, it's just really nice because these are standardized areas of evidence and they have standardized implications. So, rather than just think about higher visibility, you can think about these specifics in terms of, for age of onset, life stages. Okay, so if a trait arises at the age of 1 and then carries on until the age of 95, something like language, then to explain language, you should, whatever the function of language is, it should explain its duration. And, in the case of language, it's communication, and that perfectly fits with the fact that you need to communicate basically as long as you can. Babies are really just quickly trying to learn to communicate. As soon as they can communicate for life until they get, really diseased and old. Okay. Something like aggressive risk-taking. Now, if that arises in adolescence for males, then that that narrows down the sort of hypotheses to beyond those that are that would be narrowed down to if you were like looking at the whole lifespan, right? So to simplify, traits that arise in adolescence, probably related to like adolescent challenges, okay? If you hit 14 and you start really becoming anxious about socializing and how do I fit in, and then that sort of tapers off by the time you're 20, 25, that duration and that exact age of onset is a really important fact for narrowing down the hypotheses of why social anxiety exists, okay? This is, so you can do this with all of these areas of evidence. So I've already talked about a few of them, age of onset and duration, but for prevalence, if a trait exists in 10% of people, it's like a very different explanation to a trait that exists in 1% of people. For this, you need to think about what groups humans were interacting with, what group sizes were they interacting with. And actually, humans basically grew up with about 20 to 30, maybe around that, people that they were living with all day. Essentially, you wake up every day, you're in a sort of family group in a heart, and then those groups are part of a little band of people who get up, kind of see each other, go and hunt together, and then come back and share food. So one of the relevant group sizes to think about is like this band. So in those 30 people, where do you fit in? A trait that exists in 10% of people, because there's about 30 people in a band, a trait that exists in about 10% of people will be in about 3 people in the band. Okay, so rather than thinking about prevalence as like 1% or 10% or 5% or 50%, the way to really think about it is like how many humans were expressing this in our evolutionary history. And the two most relevant group sizes to think about were the bands of these like 30 individuals who wake up every day, and the wider social group of about 150, 165, 8 or something. And though that's the extended social network that everyone kind of knows. So bands basically wake up, hang out together, eat together, but are part of a broader social network, what you might call the tribe, who meet up seasonally or regularly and will share food and have festivals together, exchange marriage partners. This is like a broader social network of the people that you kind of know throughout your life and be able to kind of have access to at certain points for these very important things like marriage, trade, festivals, dancing, healing, warfare. These are all important factors that are like at this kind of tribe level of about 150 could matter. So yeah, your prevalence of a trait that's in 1% of people will be about once per tribe. However, of that about 150, 160, it's important to remember that like they are about half adults and half children, half male, half female as well. So if you have a trait like schizophrenia, which arises about 18, even though the lifetime prevalence of schizophrenia might be 0.7%, actually per tribe at any one time, because there's only 80 people over 18, maybe about, then there won't always be one schizophrenic in the group. So this is like an important nuance that I didn't really realize when I first got into this field. But there is, that was pointed out by peer reviewers and is actually an excellent point. You need to think about like at that time for our ancestors, were they constantly around these people? How much did they see them? How did they interact? Historically, this was most talked about in the context of psychopathy, because psychopaths, well, I mean, they're obviously sort of cheating and selfish. So it was kind of thought, well, are these people like cheating and like hiding amongst us? And there was an early paper, I think it was 1999, 1996, something like that, by Linda Mealy in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, basically pointing out that, at about the 1% level, there will be about one psychopath per extended group. So potentially, like the psychopath strategy is to sort of be able to hide amongst the groups and maybe dance between bands and never really be detected or be punished. And actually, there's some interesting anthropological evidence of people being quite psychopathic and eventually being punished. If you are too violent or start cheating or stealing or whatever, eventually people will get pissed off and probably kill you or exile you. But at this kind of 1% level, you can maybe just like dodge that for a bit. If there's too many of you, people will become too... So say the psychopath has 20 children and suddenly there's 10 psychopaths because half of them become psychopathic. Probably everyone will notice quicker that there's all these people cheating and they would get ganged up on, or the kids would start attacking each other. This is what is called negative frequency dependency. So as the trait increases in prevalence, it gets less useful for the group. Sorry, for the people who have it. Yes, anyway, cementing our hypotheses in the exact prevalence and trying to explain that prevalence. And this is super important. So like whatever your hypothesis is, whether it's toxoplasma, byproduct, social niche specialization to be a systemizer, whatever random hypothesis you have for autism, you have to explain the exact prevalence, right? As well as the exact age of onset and duration. So the last two areas of evidence are, sex differences and environmental effects. Sex differences, no, it's fairly simple, obvious. Like if there is a sex-specific effect, does it have a function for that sex? And then also in environmental factors, like is any environmental effect like plasticity reacting to a challenge, basically, an adaptive challenge in the environment? For something like autism, this might not matter. You might think it might not matter that much, although there's some elements there which I'll quickly get into soon. But the most important time to think about environmental plasticity is for understanding the evolution of emotions or like reactive states, right? So whatever your explanation of anger or shame, because remember, like this is a general evolutionary hypothesis, general evolutionary framework. You can apply this to disorders. You can also apply this to any of the traits that evolutionary psychology looks at. Whatever the explanation of shame, you should be able to explain like the environmental factors which cause shame. And you could argue that's probably the critical piece of evidence to explain. You should also explain differences in sex and prevalence and the duration and the age of onset of shame, But the general point is that, yes, for these environmental factors, especially for these kind of, reactive states like emotions, this environmental sensitivity is probably one of the most important areas of evidence to look at. Okay, so what happens when you have these hypotheses of autism and you compare how well they explain these 5 areas of evidence? Again, this is like just so beautiful because it's these simple areas that everyone can kind of agree on the basic facts and agree on the inferences because it's just basic evolutionary theory derived from human history. It's standardizable, it's simple-ish. Okay, so what we now need to do, take every hypothesis, ask, does it explain the duration? So does your hypothesis of autism explain the duration of autism? Well, if you have like a byproduct model and you're saying, okay, well, this is like an accidental byproduct of human evolution, that people will just become autistic at some particular rate, whatever. There's a kind of burden rate, right? It's like an accident. Everyone's sort of more intelligent because of it, but we just have this cost in 1% of people or 2% of people. So yeah, if that's your hypothesis, does it explain the duration of autism? And the byproduct model basically would have no preference for it can be sort of random. So in the paper we go into this, but for every one of these areas of evidence, byproduct explanations have a different type of explanation to the functional explanation. If it's a function, it's like this thing is where it's good. If it's a byproduct, then it's just sort of happened despite evolution, basically. So despite natural selection, like these byproducts arose, does this make sense of the duration of autism? Well, autism lasts for life and has a quite high impact. It's quite highly visible. The implication here is that it's pretty visible to selection, and if it's harmful, there should have been selective pressures to push out autism. So if constantly we had general intelligence and it was causing this 1%, 2% of people to become autistic, then you predict there'd be pretty strong selection to prevent that. A byproduct explanation is basically saying, yeah, it doesn't really, there's no benefit to it. It just so happens that it arises early in life. Okay, so either it just so happens, it arises early in life, and evolution can prevent that. The social niche specialization model says, okay, well, the duration of autism is related to its function or fitting into this special role in society. And, the basic hypothesis is you become an expert in something, or you become really good at some systemizing. You get recognized for your abilities. Does that hypothesis explain the duration of autism? Well, yeah, actually, pretty well. That's the hypothesis is basically that you spend your life fitting into this niche, and yeah, we see that autism exists for life. So okay, tick, fine. That's pretty decent. Byproduct model. Okay, you can have, maybe it's an accident, maybe there's a byproduct that just lasts for life. It's not what you predict, but okay, maybe random stuff does happen, and it's still good enough for the population that it doesn't really matter that these 1% of people, 2% of people have basically a dysfunction or a disease for life. Okay, so yeah, moving on to, that sort of captures age of onset as well, because the question is, is the age of onset explained by the hypothesis? For the social niche hypothesis, basically the idea is, you start as a kid, becoming being quite autistic and in your own world, but by your adulthood, you've sort of probably managed to gain some good skills in areas that are valued by the society, and so notably, a lot of the most harmful autism symptoms are visible in children, but actually a lot of autistic people become quite good at camouflaging them, essentially learning to fit in. Historically, autism was thought of as just a childhood, you could only diagnose it in children. There were thought to be basically no adult autistics who'd been missed. So yeah, basically the age of effect at childhood that autism has, which can be quite severe, but then often they get better, in quotation marks. Does this fit with the social niche specialization hypothesis or the byproduct model? Well, the social niche specialization hypothesis would kind of say, as they grow up, the most important time is basically adolescence and adulthood, early adulthood, middle and late adulthood. If you're kind of disabled early in life, it probably doesn't matter that much, so long as you've been building up the skills which then make you valuable later on. So yeah, that sort of fits the age of onset that we observe and the trajectory of autistic traits over time. The byproduct model basically doesn't have anything specific to say about why this age of onset is early and then becomes and then it manifests differently over life and then gets better. But maybe you could say, okay, this is just a cost, a harm that some people are suffering with, and then they just learn, as all people kind of do learn, to fit in with that. It's not good for them, but it just becomes less bad for them because they're still human, they're still able to adapt to themselves. So yeah, it's fine. It doesn't falsify the byproduct hypothesis. It doesn't exactly fit, but you can also see that, okay, yeah, maybe this works. As a point of philosophy of science here, we can get no further than looking at the evidence, seeing whether it fits, and basically making our own subjective judgment. There is no way for science to kind of find ultimate truth in a way that explains everything and perfectly and that no one will ever disagree on. That's just impossible. Ultimately, we're looking at evidence, we're trying to see if it fits the hypothesis. People could disagree about whether or not this byproduct model better explains this evidence. And that's basically the history of most evolutionary hypothesizing, is just these unprincipled disagreements. The point of using the D-side framework is that at least we can have principled disagreements around a kind of structured set of areas of evidence. And, we could engage in this debate about how would the byproduct model explain this age of effect? That could be a debate that, is really complicated and goes on for years. I'm just giving you like a sort of overview of like why, how it could work, and also the value of like taking these specific areas of evidence. Okay, back into it. What have we got next? Say the sex differences. Now, obviously, the sex differences in autism are a really big and interesting area of evidence. We had to integrate these female cases, which were kind of being missed, but do carry a lot of these genes, and probably, there could be some function going on there, which maybe is even costly in males, who knows? How does each hypothesis explain these sex differences? So the social niche specialization hypothesis that says that basically, autistic traits are kind of for systemizing and specializing in things, is specializing in things. God, that's so broad, isn't it? Jesus. Specializing in, like systematic thinking about the thing world, the object world, rather than people. People, I suppose, are things, and maybe objects, depending on your ethics. Anyway, we're getting waylaid here. I'm a few hours in. The point of the byproduct, the social niche specialization versus the byproduct model, is that these sex differences to the social niche specialization hypothesis actually are explicitly kind of predicted and talked about by both Baron-Cohen and Baron-Cohen and Joel Giudice. What they essentially say is this male kind of prevalence, these more male traits, the likelihood of seeing autistic traits in more males, and also the fact that males in general seem to be kind of like subclinically autistic, implies that the autism spectrum is somewhat adapted for this sort of these male areas. So to make it more concrete, like the idea is that males would have benefited more from tool making and like systemizing about thinking about non-human objects than females. Partly because for females, it's actually way more important to be good at childcare mostly, but also just socializing, hanging out. Okay, so the overall take on the differences between male and female life histories throughout evolutionary history is that actually they overlap in most ways. The most critical difference is in whether you give birth and then have to nurse a child at your breast, which males don't have to do and females do have to do. And when you don't have contraception, then you're, for a lot of your adult life, you're either pregnant or breastfeeding. You get pregnant at 20, whatever, maybe earlier, maybe a little bit later. You then have a kid, you breastfeed for like 2.5 years. Then you stop breastfeeding and you start ovulating again, and you get pregnant again in a couple of years. And then you have another baby for a couple of years. So basically, like a lot of the time, maybe 20 years of your life, 15 years of your life, you're either pregnant or breastfeeding. There are some crazy estimates. I can't remember the specific numbers, but it was something like the idea that, many natural fertility women will only have 20 periods in their life or something, as in, menarche, menstrual period. Just because you're so either pregnant or breastfeeding and you just don't have periods during that time because you're not ovulating. Anyway, the point is this is a huge pressure, probably, the main pressure that has distinguished male versus female life histories. And the social niche hypothesis, the systemizing social niche specialization hypothesis says that these male strategies, or the reason that autism is more common in males, is because it's something to do with like succeeding as a male. You're better at hunting or tool creation or cooking or whatever the thing is that you need to do as a male. And it differs between individuals as to what that is. So between researchers, Baron Cohen argues that it's more about, not child caring and about hunting. Del Giudice argues that the main point is to be a sort of skillful and providing father, husband, basically, so that you, by being autistic, you impress people with your abilities in very specific areas which are valued in the marriage market. So you end up marrying because you're just an impressive individual in these kind of specific areas which are valuable. So both of them kind of talk about this sort of male prevalence. It's also possible, as I've sort of talked about earlier, that there is a different angle on this, which is that the women maybe were benefiting. Maybe the autistic women were just better at basket weaving or like keeping a home area sort of orderly and noticing things which were out of place. Like there are ways in which you can talk about autistic traits in women actually being better than autistic traits in men. And maybe then there's like just women are more buffered from the costs of that and men just suffer the costs of that. There are nuances within what like people were doing, what these strengths were doing in each individual. And to rewind to like an earlier episode, there is like, you've always got to remember that the history of humans and just evolution in general is really about individuals living unique lives with very different stories between them. Like what one autistic person or an autistic trait family did at one particular time 4,500 years ago and how they succeeded and survived will be a different story to people 4,000 years ago. And in fact, even in that one little snapshot of time 4,500 years ago, the people over here in a slightly warmer climate, if they went 200 miles the other direction, there's another autistic family and they're doing something slightly different. And even within like very closely living to each other, autistic people, they can live different lives. Everything becomes this nuanced individual challenge that can adapt to its local environment. The true story of what caused autistic traits to persist is the story that captures all of those people in living such different lives in such different climates and social environments. And you can never really hope to get like a perfect summary. And you know, it's just impossible. It's like scientifically impossible to give a nice one paragraph description of what autism is for and capture all of those people's lives. Same for any other disorder, of course, right? Or jealousy or whatever. You know, the nuances of exactly how it manifested for that person, like what does it mean to you that you got really jealous that time about, you know, your partner and you did something about it in some way that was good or bad? Or really, if you were talking about evolutionary explanations, that was good. Then, yeah, and that nuance, those many, many millions of individual stories, which we have no direct access to, but like happened inevitably and are really the explanation. Yeah, that's what we should be trying to think about. And obviously can't think about. But then this is also where, when you get back to like thinking about what this evidence implies, like these sex differences, there were generations when it was the autistic women who were doing really well and the autistic men were doing really badly, and then it maybe flipped. And, you know, and like all that mattered really was that on average over time, it worked out. And that's kind of what, you know, and the evidence that we're gathering of, for instance, the sex differences can narrow down the hypotheses. We can like make some broad claims. Like it's definitely true that the autistic traits aren't only visible in men. So if you were to provide a very, very hyper male hypothesis, and like autism is something, gives you the senses to detect whether your child is your own, right? Because men can never really know if they are their child's father, because there's paternal uncertainty. You're not really sure if your partner has cheated on you, basically, or if they've had been pregnant by another person. So say that someone provided an explanation, which is, well, autism is just for that. The predicted, and somehow autistic people are just really good at noticing this. And you could even find a random study. You could run a psych study and see that autistic people have greater attention to detail. And, oh, maybe this is actually it. And this was a big evolutionary pressure. You can tell that story. But you then end up having to explain like the prevalence, the sex differences, all of these facts, the age of onset, right? And in that case, you'd have to say, well, actually, like, it's kind of surprising that you'd have to become autistic at the age of 1 rather than just becoming autistic, in adulthood. Like if there's a trait that's been designed to detect whether you've been cucked, then yeah, you should expect that it kind of arises around the time when you're having children, but it doesn't. That's sort of surprising. And you should also predict it to be very, very specifically male. I mean, maybe females carry some of the traits because it wasn't harmful to them. But you'd also expect it to be something that exists in loads of males. Like you'd expect that to be a really good trait that basically all males should share. Why should only 3% of people be good at it? Doesn't make any sense, right? So you can take these areas of evidence, you can say, well, does this explain this and this and this and this? And you can add it all up to say, well, this fits or doesn't fit. That's basically what evaluation is all about. Okay. In comparing the byproduct versus the specialized social niche systemizing hypothesis, God, such a mouthful, God. Let's just say the specialized minds hypothesis. Then you find that, yeah, the sex differences sort of kind of fit into some of these specialized niches, niche hypotheses. They don't really make sense of the byproduct model that Crispy puts forward in his 2016 paper doesn't really talk about these sex differences at all and why they're kind of subtler in some people. And then also they seem to be reflecting what you sort of see in the general population of males having this kind of bias towards maybe things-oriented thinking. So basically the byproduct model would just be saying, okay, well, this is all just an accident. It's like general intelligence in the population has just led to things that happen more to males, and kind of replicate this strength that you already see in males. And I don't know, that's just what happened. So you can kind of see this as like, yeah, constantly, and actually most disease hypotheses will have to use the same strategy. They say, okay, well, yeah, this is just what the disease does. This is toxoplasma. Oh yeah, it just affects males more than females. It arises early in life, has this like lifelong duration, has this different trajectory. That's just what the disease does. And yeah, if you really want to defend that, if you believe that, you really need to kind of, well, it would be a much stronger argument if you could explain why. None of these hypotheses ever really can explain why. They just say, oh, well, maybe there's, men are hugging cats more, and so they get more toxoplasma in their blood and brain. So the byproduct model can't really explicitly explain these sex differences. The systemizing kind of specialization model does, or at least it makes a decent job. It sort of fits. It's coherent. Okay, so those 3 areas of evidence are out of the way. Now, we have 2 more to test, basically, like 2 more places where these hypotheses can be compared with these standardized areas of evidence. They need to explain what's happening here. Can they do it sufficiently? So, environmental factors. Now, we said in integration that autism seemed fairly visible to selection and we didn't need to think about too many complex environmental factors. That is true, but but just in terms of like raw visibility to selection, maybe okay, we don't have to think about earlier correlates or like different manifestations of autism in our hunter-gatherer past. I mean, ideally we would find them, but let's say that we are seeing something adaptive here, which kind of is reminiscent of that hunter-gatherer past, that the lives that autistic people are playing out are somehow, manifesting different strategies because of their local environment, but it's a version of rather than something completely new to our evolutionary lineage. So the environmental factors of autism are, okay, autism doesn't really seem that related to environment. It arises early in life. However, there are interesting facts about how autism manifests depending on its local environment, which could be really highly relevant. In the same way that when emotions are reacting to specific events, like, oh my God, I've just heard someone screaming, now I'm on edge. Oh no, I just committed some massive faux pas, now I feel shame and I need to react to it. These environmental factors relate to the evolutionary history of these emotions. How autism reacts to environments should also plausibly be related to its evolutionary history. And the way that autism reacts to environments that's important, and kind of you can look at these two competing hypotheses and say, well, does this fit? Is in terms of the actual specializing like that autistic people do. So one of the common observations of autistic kids now is that they line up their toys and they flick light switches a lot, right? One of the common observations of autistic adolescents and adults now is that they have very deep interests in kind of specific species or specific types of game or collectible. So these are ways in which the autistic phenotype is manifesting in modern environments. And obviously what's happening here is quite new. Like there were no light switches or toys or collectibles. But the question is like, how did that trait manifest over evolutionary history? How does that environmental plasticity, because this is a type of plasticity, right? So this is the important point. Even though autism exists and it's like some fundamental trait that manifests whether or not you have some early life influence, it fits into its environment in these interesting ways. The example that I gave in my previous autism episode was of this Siberian reindeer herder, old grandfather Nikitin, who had 2,600 reindeer and could look at every single one and know like exactly which one was which and which one had which parents and whether it was going to win in mating competitions, all this stuff. So basically, like this incredible memory, this very like obsession around the thing that was local to old grandfather Nikitin was this reindeer, this herd of reindeer. And yeah, obviously, like if you take that basic fundamental tendency and you move it into the 21st century where you have computers, or back to, you know, the 18th century where people are making inventions and doing science for the first time, and it's the Enlightenment, the way that you manifest your autistic traits will be very different. And we see this amongst autistic and, you know, kids and adults. It really matters. Like they find the thing in their environment that sort of fits into this sort of, this sort of structure. It's like this puzzle piece that you'll find whatever in your local environment fits it. Something about repeatable systems, basically, like these systems with these certain areas of detail. And it's hard to really summarize in words what that is, but hopefully you get a sense that, you know, there's something kind of similar going on. Autistic people are kind of latching on to something in the environment. And it can often be quite valuable, like old grandfather Nikitin, or like an autistic person in the 21st century who becomes really good at, you know, either an economically valuable skill, like, you know, the traditional one is coding, but it could also be art or just memorizing any sort of procedure which needs to be memorized. So it could be economically valuable, or it could just be in their social life. They could just get really into Pokemon cards and memorize all of the Pokemon card facts, and then find a niche in like a social group of Pokemon people who then all discuss it and like find it really cool. Like traditional kind of nerd phenotype, right? So these are traits manifesting depending on the local environment, kind of finding their area of specialization, let's say. So this is like an important element of environmental plasticity, which needs to be explained. Like, why is it that autistic people do end up attracted to these certain areas and becoming quite expert in them and remembering everything about them and having this attention to detail, which other people don't have. That needs to be explained, whatever your hypothesis, whether it's toxoplasma or intelligence byproduct or systemizing specialization. So how would the byproduct model account for that? Well, okay, yeah, maybe you could say there's high intelligence in the population, and then it sort of like manifests badly in some individuals, and then they just kind of, it just so happens that they try and like work with what they've got, and then end up finding things that they're good at. It's a little bit weird though, right? It's definitely not what you would predict if you were just saying, hey, look, there's high intelligence in the population, but there's going to be costs to it. Well, like you wouldn't necessarily predict that those costs involve people who become super specialist in some area and above neurotypical ability. Okay, you can kind of tell a story afterwards about why that might happen, but it's sort of surprising, right? Obviously, the systemizing specialization hypothesis would exactly predict that. It like perfectly says, well, if these people were to be fitting into a local niche, then the tendency needs to be, well, I'll wake up as an autistic person and look around my environment and find things which kind of fit my cognition, and that actually can be quite socially valuable. I really want to do this research. Hopefully, within 10 years, I swear I'm trying to like get this research done, to just go across cultures, see in these places where they don't even know what autism is. Do we find those nerds, And actually, I've talked to some anthropologists who've lived in these sorts of villages, and they do know, like this old grandfather nicotine example is not the only one. They're like, oh yeah, there was always that weird guy who kind of knew loads of spells, or knew loads about when the weather was going to change, and everyone kind of knows that they're sort of like out there and a bit strange, but like they're kind of genius in some other way. So these anecdotes do exist. There probably are more out there in the literature that we just haven't found. But yes, so the hypothesis would be autistic traits are manifesting, kind of depending on the environment, people are finding their niche. Very clearly, this aligns with the specialization hypothesis. That's the environmental variable done. And so we're onto this final area of visibility, which is prevalence. So whatever your explanation, you should be explaining the specific prevalence of a particular trait. Toxoplasma, why does autism exist in 1%, 3% of people, and you have this spectrum in 5 to 10% of people? Why is that? Is that because 1% of people are really vulnerable to toxoplasma? Is it because they're the only ones who've caught toxoplasma? But then what about these 10%? Maybe they've caught toxoplasma, but the 1% of people are like more susceptible to the harms of it. But then do you actually find toxoplasma in that many people? These are the sorts of questions you need to be asking. From an evolutionary perspective, whatever your evolutionary explanation, if it was that autism is for detecting infidelity of your partner, then you should predict that it's pretty common, because especially for men, they don't want to be cucked. So yeah, so the prediction of that would be whatever, all men theoretically should have that trait. So the byproduct model and the social niche specialization model have kind of different predictions here, right? On the one hand, we have this hypothesis that says these people fit into a niche in our ancestral life. On the other hand, you have a hypothesis which says this is just like an offshoot, an overshoot of intelligence. Intelligence is good for everyone, whatever, 100% of people, most people are benefiting from these genes in the population. There's occasional costs, but there's no specific reason to believe why those costs should be low or high. They could be arbitrarily high or low. It could be that high intelligence is bad for all of us in some ways, or that it's bad for 0.01% of people. Doesn't matter. It's all just like a byproduct. Nothing to see here, no adaptive reason. The social niche specialization hypothesis is saying something quite different, which is that the frequency at which these traits arise is the rate, like the size of the niche, basically, like how many people it will be good to have being autistic in this particular environment. That is so this is very distinct. And the predictions are that if you look at the rates of autism and autism spectrum, that should be basically what that should relate to what the autistics were doing. So does the observed prevalence of autism get better explained by byproducts or toxoplasma or social niche specialization? Toxoplasma seems bonkers, and I am actually, okay, this isn't out of nowhere that I reference this. I do know a researcher who I won't name who really does believe toxoplasma is the cause of all mental illness, and I have kind of gone through these areas of evidence with him before, and anyway, I find it implausible. I put a lot of money on it being implausible, and there's no good evidence of it, but some people get a little bee in their bonnet about some particular pathology and run with it. I mean, that will be one of my final comments on this, on that, yes, that tendency which we need to end. Okay, how do these hypotheses explain the observed prevalence of autism, which is, okay, obviously the diagnosis differs between countries and whatever, but let's say a few % of people can be kind of like quite autistic, like now can be diagnosed, previously weren't being, but So at the about 3% level, what does that mean in terms of a hunter-gatherer group? Well, it means that about one or two adults per kind of extended social group could classify as what we call autistic. So these are the extended tribes where everyone kind of knows there's someone over there who is like that. Like you've met them before, maybe sometimes you live with them, sometimes you don't live with them, you know their families, you know them by name, you've met them, you go to festivals with them. So at this kind of rates that we're looking at today, there will be one autistic person per group, per extended network. In terms of these broad autism traits, like the much more common sort of spectrum-y stuff, maybe between 5 to 7 to 10% of people, at that sort of rate, then you would see that in basically every band of individuals. So everyone who wakes up every day with this group of like 20 will have maybe even like one adult and one child being, on like at that level of the spectrum, just like slightly spectrum-y. Okay, and that's life for hundreds of thousands of years. Does that fit the social niche specialization hypothesis? Well, actually, yeah, right? But whatever those people were doing, and it would always be a different story, whether it's reindeers or certain types of plants or whatever, having a few people, like a couple of people in this wider network who are actually even more extreme and like have the tendency that and it's quite costly, but actually maybe they're even more intensely encyclopedically knowledgeable about something, versus in the spectrum, people who are just a bit more like rational and reasonable and maybe a little bit more awkward, but get things done in a very precise way or have good attention to detail. Again, these stories are always going to differ between every single group in the same way that every single autistic person today differs. But that doesn't matter. That's actually part of it, right? That's part of the explanation, is that you fit into your local group. You find a thing that you're interested in, hopefully that it's socially valuable. This is one of the really good things that we need to be able to test, is if we go cross-culturally to the places where we haven't really been diagnosing autism, are the things that the weirdos who are like on the edge of society, are the things that they're kind of obsessed with and good at actually also socially valuable? Is there a tendency for autistics to kind of attach to things which end up being socially valuable? My prediction is yes. I think that most of the things that especially adolescent and adult autistics get into, like, is sort of valuable. Like there is a way, there is like a niche, there's a sort of social group who respect it. Okay, we live in such a weird world where not everyone respects Pokemon cards. Sad world. But but yeah, some people do. And it's not like the only person in the world who loves Pokemon cards is this one autistic person. So yeah, I mean, like, and also this, to make it like an aside point on how to help autistic people fit into the world, probably the best thing you can do is just try and channel your autism into something valuable, right? Don't get hooked on the useless internet game that actually won't become useful in your career. Find something that is at least socially valuable for just to find a friend group and to have people to connect with, but hopefully economically valuable as well. So you can like find a job and then you'll smash it, you know, and a lot of the most successful and wealthy people in the world are autistic people who've managed to become autistic in something, or obsessed about something which everyone will pay them eventually billions of dollars to be good at. So the prevalence, is it explained by the systemizing social niche specialization hypothesis? Yeah, it's pretty good. Also, note that it would be falsified. This hypothesis wouldn't work if it was too rare. Like if there weren't enough, if autism was so rare that it just wasn't in every social group, then it couldn't have an adaptive function of being part of this like specialized niche. Okay, does the byproduct model explain the specific prevalence? Well, I mean, basically you just have to say, well, these costs just arise in this proportion of the population. It's just sort of accidental that it happens to be 1% or 3%, and then like there's this whole spectrum that's visible. Yeah, the fact that one person in every band was waking up kind of on the spectrum, that was just like part of the cost. The fact that every extended tribe always had 1 or 2 people who are actually, you know, slightly more autistic, that's just part of the cost. There's no principled reason why you'd expect those exact values. It's just, that's what happened. Okay, so that's those 5 areas of evidence. We're through the main stages of evaluation. And there's nuances which I go into in the paper, of course, which I'm not going to go into here. But what do we end up with? Well, basically what we end up doing is taking these various hypotheses, and again, you can take whatever hypothesis you've got for whatever disorder you're interested in, you can take right now and see, going through these 5 areas of evidence with these standardized implications, does it fit or does it not fit? How much are you trying to kind of finagle your way into this like box? Does it sound like just so storytelling? Like the joy of the joy of the DSI framework is that you're really pushed to look at these 5 areas of evidence with these standardized implications and just think through the connotations. And you can compare your hypothesis versus the other hypotheses and just ask, does it add up? Does it explain these facts? And ultimately what we're trying to find, what you would expect to find if you've hit a true hypothesis, is that every single one of these areas is justifying the original hypothesis. Like it just fits in. Oh yeah, that kind of fits. Yeah, that fits. Oh, that fits. Oh, that's exactly what we'd expect to see if autism is for fitting into this specialist niche. If your hypothesis does not, if it like is challenged by these 5 areas, the thinking about the visibility, basically, the visibility of the trait, is it, and if you try and take it to these areas and it's like, oh, it doesn't really work, like, yeah, maybe, or like this area does, but this area is actually really doesn't work, then it's not going to work. And if even one of these areas just really doesn't fit, frankly, you have to throw out the hypothesis. Sorry, that's basically falsification. Okay, you just say, look, whatever, the solitary forager hypothesis of autism. If you ask, which is basically that, you know, some autistic people should go out being solitary and foraging alone. If you go through all of these areas and you ask whether it really fits, so okay, so say the age of effect and duration, right? Like, does it really work? Is it really sensible for that trait to arise really early in life when you don't actually need to be hunting until you're like 15? Yeah, that doesn't really make sense. Actually, what you'd probably expect is that, yeah, in the same area of life where you start becoming socially anxious, and, you know, feeling all sorts of funny, heart-pumping-y feelings about, like, you know, trying to find romantic relationships, evolution is very good at picking traits which should manifest in adolescence. Being a solitary forager then, that would fit. Like, if there is a trait that arises then and makes you kind of wander off and start hunting on your own, then, like, maybe that's for helping you be a solitary forager. And then you also have to explain the environmental factors and the prevalence and all that stuff. it's going to struggle, right? When we run through the DSI framework and we compare the systemizing versus the byproduct model, this actually, it does really fit. Like, it's surprisingly fitting. Now, there are nuances here, and you can narrow down. I think that basically what this narrows down to is some sort of specialization, some sort of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, basically because prevalence especially of a trait which is like common enough to be in every tribe and also in every band, but also, you know, early onset and last for life and stuff. This is all the sort of stuff that you would expect for like fitting into a niche hypothesis, like generally. Now, whether or not it's about systemizing explicitly, or it's about attention to detail, or it's about like sensory sensitivities. People with autism have better, or like have more intense sensory sensitivities. Maybe that was actually like a niche to fit into. And these are areas of evidence which, or these are hypotheses which these areas of evidence won't like help you really decide between, because they're basically all coherent with a systemizing, specializing, with a specializing niche hypothesis. However, yeah, we have at least narrowed down. And yeah, when we look at the byproduct model, did it explain all the areas of evidence? Was it what we predicted? Basically, no. Like it's at every stage, the byproduct model, like thinking that actually the thing that is good is just in the general population and all of the autism is bad. That just doesn't really explain like the age of onset, the duration, all of these factors. Why should it be so, like, why should it attach to areas of the environment which really matter? Why should it be in this proportion of the population so that everyone knows someone? Evolution, natural selection, if this is a harm, it should have really kind of got rid of it. There should have been really strong pressure to just prevent these autistic traits arising. At every stage, you kind of have to excuse it and say, well, yeah, I don't know. It's like, it's not, maybe it's not falsifying, but it's just not, it doesn't really explain the evidence, right? So yeah, you come out of this and you say, well, okay, that's pretty good. We've judged the leading hypotheses of autism. We've seen which ones best explain the available evidence that also fits the strengths as well. Like, but we couldn't decide between hypotheses just by looking at the strengths. We needed to look at this circumstantial evidence as well. And we've kind of triangulated in and narrowed down towards a decent evolutionary explanation. Now, the joy is you could do this for any trait. You can apply these same principles in the same formulaic manner for, psychological traits like jealousy. In the paper, we go into how jealousy is sort of explained and analyzed through this framework. Basically, you see that yes, jealousy arises when you're in a romantic relationship, when you're a certain age. It sort of, it reacts to environmental factors of whether or not you're likely to be cheated on. Okay, like if you took these classic traits of evolutionary psychology, also just basic stuff, like I mentioned, language, the adaptation should always be related to its visibility, basically. It's a simple standard principle. You can take this for every trait. Once you've done the complicated stuff that you have to do in evolutionary medicine and psychiatry to try and expand your cluster to see, it's not the eating disorder that has to be explained, but maybe the personality difference behind it. Maybe it's not the extreme major depression in this one individual, but it's like depressive tendencies in general that manifest in weird environments in major depression. Then you can run through, like, when does it arise? Are there sex differences? What's the prevalence? And you will be able to get to a better system for deciding between these hypotheses, for contemplating them, for studying them, for like deciding which experiments to run, because you can just narrow down. So yeah, there's like huge potential here, and this is sort of what the evolutionary biology literature has been looking for, but hasn't really needed, because it was dealing with stuff that was so intuitively adaptive that you don't need such basic facts to help you decide. And frankly, also what Darwin needed, but he just didn't have the evidence. And we're also at this amazing point in human history where we have so much more evidence, especially from genetics, but also at a population-wide level, the amount of data we have, and which will only grow, we will be able to use this to narrow down these hypotheses really nicely. You know, especially with smart data and, oh man, it's just, yeah, there's so much potential. And yes, you could even really apply it to diseases like heart disease, which are complex and not related to some specific pathology, but arise late in life. If you start by describing, categorizing, and integrating heart disease, you would see, oh, okay, well, you know, it rises more in men, but like, what are the female manifestations? And also, what are the early life connotations? Is there something going on there, like testosterone, which means that you are slightly more successful in early life, but you have this cost of heart disease later in life? Same, frankly, with cancer, like your cells are replicating efficiently, but then at some point later in life, you end up developing cancer because they reproduce too quickly or your mechanisms break down. Like every disease that's complex and there's heritable factors, you should be able to explain by looking back at this like extended visibility. And to give this adaptive explanation, you can start by looking at, visibility, and like what the functional implications and what the possible things are to look for in terms of strengths, benefits to fitness. Yes, there is huge potential, and yeah, I'm sort of optimistic. This is, as I say, this is something I've been working on for 9 years in different stages, and it was a problem of multiple problems, and I'm sorry how complicated and long this got. My God, it was 4 hours, was it? Yeah, Jesus. Okay, but 9 years summarized in 4 hours isn't that bad, right? Sorry. Yeah, just like so many little problems to fix, and like, oh no, dead ends. Oh God, it was fun. Anyway, yes, this is the contribution. Thank you. I will end on one little note. So I think that one of the biggest problems in pathology research, biomedicine, also psychiatry, and even like, you know, pre-biological psychiatry, this is maybe a problem of the human psyche more than anything else, is that we've looked for and been very attracted to these very simple explanations of bad thing X causing Y. And you'll say something like, okay, yeah, like the toxoplasma example is quite good. You find this bad thing and you're like, wait a minute, maybe this one bad thing. Oh, it's chemical imbalance. Oh, it's trauma. Oh, it's toxoplasma. And it's a very normal human response to see a bad trait, like, oh, autism's bad, schizophrenia is bad, anxiety is bad, eating disorders bad. Okay, what else is bad that like maybe sort of relates to it? Trauma, toxoplasma, chemical imbalance. And we love these like simple reductionistic explanations, which sometimes kind of turn out to be true. Germ theory, like, yeah, germs are bad. Actually, behind all the infectious diseases, there are like these little microbes and viruses and stuff. You get a microscope out, you can actually find them, right? Now that is a real success for the single bad thing, although they were never really single bad things, were they, right? It was like thousands of things that are mutating and whatever. But yeah, bad thing happened, basically. That is the simple pathology mindset. And that has driven decades of biomedical research, looking for these simple causes of pathology, and eventually, I think, unfortunately, doing what all humans do, which actually evolutionary researchers have done just as much, which is try and like take your one simple pathology explanation, take this simple explanation, and then fit all of the evidence around that. So, you know, in the same way that the evolutionary researchers have been taking these areas of evidence that like really tenuously fit in, or cherry picking these particular strengths or weaknesses and saying, oh, this all makes sense in my one great hypothesis. Look, it's all mitochondrial dysfunction. Yes, everything, the cancer, the heart disease, all mitochondrial dysfunction. Or it's all toxoplasma. And look, oh, we did this one experiment and that fitted. Amazing. Okay, so this is like basically the history of medicine and psychiatry is this, I think. The history of modern psychiatry, before we started realizing it was super complex, even pre-science, right? Like there's often some simple explanation: bad spirits, curses. Oh, it's a curse. Oh, it's a curse. Disease, curse. Bad weather, curse. Oh, broken leg, curse. We love having these simple explanations, and you can't hate it too much because maybe it's from this instinct that perhaps the scientific enterprise is born, and that we started asking why. We are just these creatures that ask why, and I understand that the reason that when we ask why, we want simple explanations, and we are very happy to fit whatever is happening into that explanation. Now, this is obviously familiar because this is what the just-so storytelling critique was about. And admittedly, many evolutionary researchers were, fitting in evidence in this sort of quite unprincipled way, and we're talking about this historical hypothesis that we can't actually observe. Fine. However, I do think that in the realm of disorder, and especially in mental disorder, where, okay, it's so intuitive that there's something going wrong and something simple in schizophrenia, and maybe it's like dopamine. Oh, it's the dopamine thing. Yeah, let's find the dopamine circuit, and you test the dopamine in the rat, and it looks kind of schizophrenic, and you're like, my God, it's all the dopamine. Yeah, sure. Obviously, that hasn't actually panned out. The point that I'm trying to make is that these pathology researchers, the people who, and okay, like most, let's say this, most of the scientific establishment, maybe you're listening to this, or hopefully you're listening to this, there is a tendency to sort of fit everything under this one hypothesis and just look for it and look for it and look for it. Alzheimer's is a really good example of this with the amyloid hypothesis. Is it all amyloids? How is it amyloids? Make it all fit in. I think that basically what we've been doing in psychiatry and psychology is not just so storytelling, which is trying to fit it all into this perfect explanation, which has an evolutionary tinge to it. What we've really been doing in clinical psychology and psychiatry is just no storytelling. Okay, this is a little play on words here. I'm unreasonably proud of this. It's quite fun. This is what, year 6 into thinking about this stuff. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's a fun little thing to end the paper on. So yes, I think like just no storytelling is super common, where we just get fixed on these like bad thing going wrong. Like, oh, this is bad. We have to find the chemical that's wrong with the schizophrenics, or the virus which is causing the disorder. And what we essentially do is kind of unprincipled, unreasonable fitting of the available evidence to try and fit our hypothesis, unaware and sort of oblivious to the fact that we are just saying, no, there must be something bad here. No, it must be pathology. Whereas actually, a lot of the time, there's probably a bigger picture, which is like, yes, there is something adaptive. There is some adaptive process going on. Okay, often it's causing harm in a particular individual or for a particular period of time, but that doesn't mean that this is simple breakage. And this is, I think, the thing that evolutionary principles and specifically the D-side framework can really help us work out and work towards, is what is the best evolutionary explanation. But we need to stop saying no and storytelling about it. Frankly, the amount of time and money that's been wasted on just no storytelling, constantly chasing pathology, spending billions and billions and billions of dollars, about $4 billion a year, tens of billions of dollars over time, thousands of people's lives being essentially wasted looking for the true pathological cause of autism or schizophrenia. We were just so wrapped up in thinking that it was a no and storytelling, like just no storytelling, that we ended up, wasting billions of dollars, people's careers, and never actually helping the people that psychiatry should be trying to help. So I think that we really need to recognize that the evolutionary psychologists have not spent that much money and time in such an important area. I shouldn't laugh, it's actually horrifying. But yes, I think we do need to realize where the just no storytelling is. And if you lay out the evidence in this way, and you make it really clear wait a minute, this is inherited. Oh, it's early onset. Oh, it's reacting in this kind of nuanced way to the environment. Oh, it's prevalent enough to be in every group. What really should come out is that simple pathological explanations are really, really going to struggle to explain this variation. There's a load of complexities there, which I haven't even gone into here, but they're kind of mentioned in the paper, but also that need to be worked out, by people more switched on than me. Then, we need to stop simply saying no and wasting time and effort and money and letting people's lives play out with this bad story. You're telling them, oh, it's a breakage. Sorry, it's a breakage, but we don't know what, and we haven't found it, and we're still spending the money, and we're still killing the rats and trying to find the breakage, but yeah, don't know what it is, but we know it's a no. We know it's just bad. Even for the people who are suffering unduly and might not have even had historical reproductive success, say, it's sort of like the quite extreme autistic, and it's not categorized as a pathology, but it is maybe too far on the spectrum, or it's like the 1 in 1,000. But it's still just an offshoot of this extreme autistic phenotype. They're still going to have some of those strengths. And there's still a more hopeful story to tell, which is that, hey, you're manifesting this trait, which was adaptive over the histories of the population. And you're you've drawn a pretty tough card there, man, or woman. But there's something there which relates to our history of a species evolving, and we've benefited from it as a population. I think it's entirely justifiable, in fact, really a moral necessity that we care for those people now, because we are all benefiting from, our ancestors who had these traits and who've passed them on to us. And telling these different stories, getting past just no storytelling, which has never even been successful, and just telling people that's something wrong with you, don't know what, and also moving past just so storytelling and just looking to the evidence that we have available. Okay, depending on the trait, there might be good, better or worse evidence available, but let's just narrow down these hypotheses. Let's think about what's possible, and let's give us permission to start thinking outside of this simple pathology lens and into this expanded lens, which thinks about human history, thinks about these traits beyond the disorder, thinks about strengths, changes what mental disorder means, changes how we understand it scientifically. It's all possible. It's all right there. The evidence is there. We just need to put it together in the right way and with the right theory. Yes, it is possible, I think, now. And I hope that some of you will start doing so, or just even thinking through this lens about yourself or about the traits you're particularly interested in. And we have a scientific and social challenge to solve, and I think it's actually solvable. So thank you for listening. Let's stop the just no storytelling. Let's stop the just so storytelling. Let's decide what the best explanations really are and how we want to go about life with a better framework for understanding the evolutionary explanations of our traits, but also, disorders specifically. Thank you for listening.
The Evolving Psychiatry Podcast is financially supported by the Human Ecology Group of the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine at the University of Zurich.